Chapter 1: The night the phone would not stop ringing. The phone rang at 2 minutes past midnight, and nobody moved at first. Ink hung heavy in the air, metallic and sour, mixing with the burnt smell of old coffee that had been reheated too many times. The newsroom was almost empty. A few desks still glowed under tired lamps, like islands of stubbornness in a sea of darkness. Outside, San Francisco slept uneasily, fog rolling low and thick, swallowing streetlights whole. The phone rang again. Sharp. Insistent. Angry. A junior editor finally picked it up with fingers stained black from newsprint. He listened. His face drained, not dramatically, not like in the movies, but slowly, as if the color was embarrassed to stay. There was no scream on the line. No confession. Just a voice. Calm. Polite. Almost bored. "I have something for you," the voice said. "You'll want to print it." The call ended before a question could be asked. 5 minutes later, the envelope arrived. Nobody saw who dropped it off. That detail would haunt them later. It always did. The envelope was thick, off-white, cheap. The address was printed carefully, too carefully, each letter standing straight like it was proud of itself. Inside were pages. Symbols. Circles. Crosses. Slashes. A child's puzzle drawn by a patient adult hand. And a message written with the kind of confidence that comes only when you believe the world is already listening. At the bottom of the page, a symbol stared back at them. A circle. A crosshair. A promise. Somewhere in the city, someone was already dead. They just did not know where yet. The editor swallowed and wiped his palms on his trousers. Sticky sweat. Cold metal from the desk edge bit into his skin as he leaned forward. He had the irrational thought that the paper itself was warm, as if it had been alive a moment ago. "Call the police," someone whispered. They always said that. As if it mattered. By morning, the story would be everywhere. By evening, the name would be born. And from that moment on, nothing would belong only to the victims anymore. Not the fear. Not the truth. Not even the silence. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then stopped. The phone rang again. This time, everyone was watching. The man on the other end of the line smiled, though no one could see it. He imagined them huddled together under buzzing lights, smelling fear and ink and regret. He liked to picture details. It made things feel orderly. "Fair. You're late," he said gently. "I was beginning to think you didn't care." He hung up. Across California, detectives would later argue about timelines, about handwriting, about whether the killer was organized or merely theatrical. They would miss the most important clue entirely. He was not calling to announce a murder. He was calling to make sure they were paying attention. And somewhere between the ringing phone and the waiting dawn, the city learned its new habit, listening for a voice that might never come again, and fearing the silence even more. Because the worst part was not that someone was killing. The worst part was that he wanted to be understood. And he was willing to wait. Chapter 2: Do you really think monsters hide in the dark? By dawn, the city pretended nothing had changed. Milk bottles clinked onto porches. Buses sighed at corners. Men in pressed shirts read headlines with one hand while stirring sugar into their coffee with the other. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It slipped in quietly, like fog through a cracked window, settling into corners where no one thought to look. You think monsters hide in the dark? That was the first lie people told themselves. The real comfort came from believing that evil had rules. That it wore a certain face. That it waited in alleys and shadows, not under fluorescent lights or behind polite smiles. The newspapers helped with that. They always did. They gave the fear a name, a shape, a symbol that could be circled in red ink. Zodiac. It sounded almost playful. Astrological. Harmless. As if destiny itself had picked up a pen and decided to get clever. At the police station, the letter lay under glass like an artifact from a lost civilization. Detectives leaned over it with cigarettes dangling from their lips, ash trembling, threatening to fall onto the very thing they were supposed to protect. The symbols stared back, indifferent. They did not care about rank or experience. They did not reward effort. Could be a kid, one officer muttered. Some college joker. Another shook his head slowly. Kids don't wait this long to be heard. The phone calls started coming in before lunch. Tips. Sightings. Certainty spoken with the confidence of people who wanted to matter. A man who walked funny. A neighbor who never waved. A teacher who liked puzzles too much. Suspicion spread faster than truth ever could. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a man listened to the radio and smiled again. He liked the debates. He liked how quickly people reached for explanations that made them feel safe. A crazy loner. A sexual deviant. A genius. A nobody. Every theory said more about the speaker than the subject. He had learned something important early on: if you give people a mystery, they will decorate it themselves. The first confirmed murders were already being replayed in whispers. A parked car. A quiet road. Youth and expectation crushed under sudden violence. Lovers who thought the world had all the time it needed. The reports were clinical. Entry wounds. Exit wounds. Time of death approximated. The paperwork did not mention the sound of breathing turning wet, or the way hope collapses when it realizes it has been lied to. That part lived elsewhere. In nightmares. In pauses during dinner. In the way hands shook just slightly longer when locking car doors. The killer understood something the city did not want to admit. People were not afraid of death. They were afraid of randomness. And he was very good at providing it. A detective stood at the window, watching fog erase the street one car at a time. He rubbed his eyes and thought, not for the first time, that the letter felt personal. Not because it mentioned him. But because it assumed him. Assumed he would read it. Study it. Obsess over it. As if the killer already knew him. As if the killer had planned for exactly this reaction. By the end of the day, the department would issue statements. Reassurances. Carefully measured lies designed to keep panic neat and manageable. They would say progress was being made. They would say there was no reason to fear. And the city would nod, grateful for the performance. That night, someone would check their locks twice and laugh nervously at themselves. Across town, the men with the codes sharpened a pencil and wondered how long it would take before someone asked the right question. Not who he was. But why he wanted them to watch. Because once you understand that, the rest becomes unbearable. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 3, Before he had a name. Before he was Zodiac, he was just noise. California in those years looked like a promise that had not yet learned how to disappoint. Radios hummed with optimism. Cars were long and glossy, built for confidence, not caution. Teenagers parked at the edges of towns, engines ticking softly as they cooled, believing privacy was a natural right instead of a temporary illusion. The first reports sounded small. Isolated. Tragic in the way tragedies always are when they happen to someone else. A couple found shot near a quiet road. Another attacked in the dark, the killer walking away instead of running, as if he had nowhere else to be. Witness statements were messy. Timelines bent. Fear made memory unreliable, and memory returned the favor. Police reports reduced everything to order. Time of arrival. Condition of bodies. Weather. No mention of how the night smelled like damp grass and gasoline. No line for the moment when an officer realizes he is too late and always was. The killer watched the coverage carefully. He noticed what they emphasized and what they skipped. He noticed how the word random appeared again and again, like a prayer. Random meant no pattern. No pattern meant no responsibility. It was comforting that way. But he was not random. That was the irony. He was meticulous where it mattered and careless where it did not. He left survivors sometimes, not out of mercy, but out of efficiency. Panic made people sloppy. Sloppy people told stories. Stories created attention. Attention was the real currency. At a diner off the highway, a waitress refilled a cup without being asked. The man thanked her and smiled politely. His clothes were ordinary. His posture forgettable. He paid in cash and left no tip. Outside, the neon flickered like a nervous habit. He liked places like that. Places where nobody was special enough to be remembered. The papers struggled with tone. They did not want to frighten people. They did not want to bore them either. So they compromised, which meant they did both poorly. Headlines hedged. Details were softened. Violence was framed like weather, unfortunate but unavoidable. The killer laughed at that. Weather did not write letters. In police briefings, theories multiplied. A jealous boyfriend. A drifter. A thrill seeker. Each explanation carried the quiet hope that the story could end neatly, with handcuffs and a photograph taken under bad lighting. Nobody asked why the killer had not already disappeared. Because he did not want to. He wanted witnesses. Survivors. Readers. He wanted a dialogue where only one side asked questions and only one side decided when answers were allowed. The city sensed it before it could articulate it. A subtle shift. Doors locked earlier. Dates ended sooner. Radios turned down at night, as if silence itself could hear better. Fear does not arrive screaming. It arrives adjusting furniture. And somewhere between the second shooting and the third rumor, the killer realized something that would change everything. If he spoke directly, they would have to listen. If he signed his work, they would help spread it. He did not need to hide anymore. He needed a name. And soon, the city would give him one. Whether it wanted to or not. Chapter 4, Symbols, Codes, and the Pleasure of Being Smarter Than Everyone. The name arrived wrapped in arrogance. Zodiac. It appeared in ink, confident and theatrical, as if the killer had finally decided to step fully into the light. The symbol came with it, a circle crossed cleanly through the center, like a target that believed itself to be the center of the universe. Simple. Memorable. Impossible to ignore. The letters grew bolder after that. They arrived at newspapers folded with care, never rushed, never messy. Each one carried puzzles, cryptograms that promised revelation but delivered only frustration. He wrote as if he were correcting homework, disappointed but patient. I like killing people because it is so much fun, one letter claimed, with the casual cruelty of someone discussing a hobby. Then, almost teasingly, he warned them not to print his code unless they wanted more bodies. It was blackmail disguised as a parlor trick. And they printed it anyway. Of course they did. 2 schoolteachers cracked one of the ciphers and handed the solution to the police, expecting relief, perhaps closure. What they found instead was disappointment. No confession. No identity. Just more philosophy from a man who believed death was a game and people were pieces. I will not give you my name, he wrote. Because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for the afterlife. Slaves. The word landed heavy, ancient and obscene. It revealed more than he intended. Not about his beliefs, but about his need. Control dressed up as cosmology. Violence justified by imagination. In police offices, codebreakers worked under flickering lights, chalkboards filling with symbols and half-theories. Every solved cipher felt like progress until it wasn't. Each answer only led to another question, another performance. The killer understood puzzles better than most. Not because he was a genius. But because he knew the goal was not to be solved. The goal was to be admired. He mocked the police openly, correcting their mistakes, pointing out missed opportunities. He included details only the killer could know, just enough to keep his credibility intact. Truth, sprinkled carefully, like salt on a wound. Detectives argued over the letters late into the night. Some thought they were dealing with a mastermind. Others suspected a fraud with a taste for drama. Both camps missed the simplest explanation. He was ordinary. And that was the most dangerous thing about him. The public followed along eagerly. Newspapers ran diagrams. Radio hosts speculated. Dinner tables turned into amateur crime labs. Everyone wanted a piece of the mystery, and Zodiac was generous enough to provide it. He had turned murder into participation. That was the real crime. Each letter tightened the knot between killer and audience. Fear became interactive. Curiosity became complicity. People read his words with the same guilty fascination reserved for scandals and disasters, telling themselves it was different because it was important. Zodiac thrived on that distinction. He was not hiding in the shadows anymore. He was sitting at the table and smiling at how easy it was to be invited. Somewhere in the city, a detective stared at the latest letter and felt something colder than fear crawl up his spine. The killer was not racing against time. He was enjoying it. And when someone enjoys a game this much, they never quit voluntarily. They wait until the board is covered in pieces that cannot be put back. And that moment was coming. Chapter 5: The Men on the Other End of the Line. The phone rang inside the police station just after midnight. Not the frantic kind. Not the kind that came with shouting or panic. This ring was measured. Patient. As if whoever had dialed knew exactly how long it would take before someone answered. An officer picked it up with his shoulder, still finishing a report. He almost missed the first words. "I want to report a murder," the voice said. No tremor. No excitement. Just clarity. The officer straightened. The room seemed to contract around him. He asked for a location. The voice gave one, precise and unhurried, like a man ordering food he had memorized long ago. Then, softly, almost helpfully, the voice added, "I'm the one who did it." Silence followed. Thick. Heavy. The kind that presses against the ears. The officer swallowed. His knuckles whitened around the receiver. He asked the question he had been trained to ask, the one that felt suddenly useless. "Who is this?" A pause. Just long enough to feel intentional. "You know who this is," the voice replied. "I'm the Zodiac." The line went dead. Across California, similar calls would come. Sometimes to police. Sometimes to dispatchers. Always calm. Always polite. He said, "Please." He said, "Thank you." He corrected addresses when officers repeated them wrong. It was the civility that stayed with them, long after the details blurred. One dispatcher would later say the voice reminded her of a man asking for directions. Another said it sounded like someone smiling with his eyes closed. No yelling. No threats. Just information. He wanted credit, not chaos. At the crime scenes, officers moved carefully, flashlights cutting through darkness that smelled of wet asphalt and cordite. Bodies confirmed what the voice already knew. He was never wrong about the facts that mattered. The killer followed up, of course. Letters arrived explaining things the police had missed. He corrected timelines. Clarified sequences. Once, he even apologized for any inconvenience caused by bad directions. The black humor landed with a dull thud in the pit of every reader's stomach. He enjoyed the professionalism of it. The detectives did not laugh. They pinned transcripts to boards, replayed recordings until the tape warped. They argued over accents, cadence, breathing. One swore he heard a smile. Another insisted the voice was flat, dead. Someone suggested it sounded like a man pretending not to care. That suggestion lingered. Because pretending requires effort. And effort implies intention. The killer understood the power of a voice. Letters could be doubted. Codes could be faked. But a call, a live wire stretched between two human beings, felt intimate in a way paper never could. For a few minutes, he existed inside their space. Inside their heads. An officer who took one of the calls would later wake up at night, convinced the phone was ringing again. Another began to answer his home phone with his badge number, just in case. Zodiac had not just inserted himself into the investigation. He had rearranged their habits. That was the point. Fear, when done correctly, does not scream. It whispers instructions. And Zodiac was very good at giving them. He did not threaten the officers directly. He did not need to. He let implication do the work. The unspoken understanding that he could call again. That he might already be listening. When the calls stopped, the silence felt wrong. Unfinished. As if a conversation had been paused, not ended. The detectives knew better than to relax. Because men who enjoy being heard rarely disappear. They just change the way they speak. And somewhere, not far away, someone was already deciding what the next message would cost. Chapter 6: Suspects Who Could Not Escape the Shadow. Once the killer had a name, the city demanded a face. It was a simple hunger. Primitive. Faces could be stared at. Judged. Hated. Faces could be punished even when the truth refused to cooperate. So the hunt shifted, subtly but decisively, from evidence to resemblance. Police boards filled with photographs. Men who were too quiet. Men who talked too much. Men who owned the wrong books, the wrong weapons, the wrong ideas. Each photograph was pinned with the same fragile hope, please let this be enough. One name rose higher than the others, dragged there by rumor, circumstantial detail, and a kind of narrative convenience that investigators are trained to resist but human beings rarely do. A schoolteacher. A heavy step. A fascination with codes. A temper that leaked out at the edges. He looked, people said, like someone who could do it. Which was never evidence. But it was close enough to be dangerous. Search warrants were served. Drawers opened. Basements illuminated by shaking flashlights. Knives. Firearms. Typewriters. Books on cryptography. Each item was held up to the light like a holy relic, examined for meaning it did not necessarily carry. Handwriting samples did not match. Fingerprints refused to cooperate. Witnesses hesitated. Timelines slipped. The facts were stubborn. The suspicion was not. The men felt it everywhere. In the way neighbors stopped waving. In the way conversations paused when he entered a room. In the sudden weight of being watched not as a person but as a possibility. This was Zodiac's quietest cruelty. He did not just kill. He infected. Other suspects followed. Mechanics. Clerks. Veterans. Each one pulled briefly into the orbit of accusation before being released, damaged but alive. Jobs were lost. Marriages cracked. Sleep became optional. Even innocence, once proven, arrived too late to be useful. The newspapers loved these men in a way that should have been illegal. They printed faces under question marks. They used words like linked and connected and sources say. They built suspense carefully, responsibly, the way professionals do when the truth refuses to be cinematic. Zodiac never corrected them. He let the wrong men burn. In letters, he teased the investigation, hinting that they were close, then mocking them for being blind. He claimed kills that did not belong to him. Denied ones that did. He rewrote his own history with the confidence of someone who knew no one could stop him. The detectives argued late into the night. Some believed the right suspect had already slipped through their fingers. Others thought Zodiac was enjoying the spectacle too much to be anyone they had seen. Both ideas were terrifying. Because one meant failure. The other meant patience. And patience was something the killer had in abundance. There was a cruel symmetry in it all. Innocent men were dissected by the public while the guilty one remained unseen, untouchable, preserved by doubt. Zodiac had achieved something rare. He had made truth optional. One investigator stared at the board long after the others had left. Photographs blurred together. Faces lost meaning. He realized, with a sinking clarity, that even if Zodiac were caught tomorrow, the damage would not rewind. Lives had already been spent. Not taken. Spent. Outside, the city buzzed softly, unaware of how close it had come to condemning the wrong man forever. Somewhere, someone laughed at a joke that was not funny. Somewhere else, someone stared at the ceiling, wondering if being cleared would ever feel like being free. And Zodiac. Zodiac watched the spectacle with satisfaction. Because nothing proved his power more clearly than this. They were tearing themselves apart for him. And he had never even asked them to. He was still waiting. And he knew they would keep guessing. Chapter 7, The Investigators Who Aged 10 Years Overnight. The building never slept, but it aged quickly. Fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in glass. Desks sagged under the weight of paper that refused to become answers. Coffee went cold untouched, then reheated, then forgotten again. The investigation did not move forward so much as it sank deeper, pulling everyone down with it. Detectives learned the sound of failure before they learned how to name it. It was the click of an empty tape recorder. The sigh of a phone that did not ring. The soft rip of a report being rewritten for the third time because nothing had changed except the date. Some of them stopped shaving. Others shaved obsessively, as if routine could substitute for progress. Cigarettes burned down between fingers without being noticed. Ash fell onto case files and no one bothered to brush it away. It all felt temporary now, even the mess. Jurisdictions fought quietly. Not with shouting, but with silences. Reports went missing. Calls were not returned. Pride became another unsolved case. Everyone wanted the arrest. No one wanted to share it. Zodiac understood that too. He exploited the gaps like a man who had studied blueprints. He referenced details that suggested inside knowledge, or at least an unnerving intuition. He mocked mistakes that should have stayed internal. Each letter landed like a finger pressed directly into a bruise. "You are not catching me," his tone implied. "You are circling yourselves." One detective kept a map pinned above his desk. Red dots marked confirmed attacks. Blue dots marked claims. The colors began to blur together. Patterns appeared, vanished, reappeared again depending on how long he stared. He stopped trusting his own eyes. Another officer took the files home at night, spreading them across his kitchen table while his wife slept in the next room. He drank quietly and chased logic in circles until dawn. In the morning, he would pack everything away neatly, as if disorder were a moral failure. They aged fast. Photographs taken months apart showed it clearly. Lines deepened. Shoulders curved inward. Voices lowered, slowed. Laughter disappeared first. Hope followed shortly after. The department issued statements to the press, polished and empty. Ongoing investigation. Significant leads. No immediate threat to the public. Lies told gently, for everyone's benefit. Especially their own. But inside, something darker settled. The realization that effort did not guarantee results. That wanting justice badly enough did not summon it. Zodiac did not need to kill during this period. The damage was self-sustaining now. His absence became its own presence. Every unsolved crime was his by default. Every strange letter, every threat, every rumor bent in his direction. The case stopped being about stopping a man. It became about surviving him. One veteran investigator stared at the evidence board late one night and felt a sudden, irrational wave of anger. Not at the killer. At the case itself. At the way it demanded everything and promised nothing. He understood then what Zodiac had truly built. Not a puzzle. A mirror. It showed them their limits. Their rivalries. Their fear of being wrong more than their fear of being late. Zodiac had not outsmarted them with brilliance. He had outlasted them with patience. As dawn crept through the windows, pale and apologetic, the detective gathered his coat. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, older, thinner, less certain. Somewhere out there, a man was waiting for the next mistake. And the worst part was knowing this. Zodiac did not need them to fail. He only needed them to keep trying. Because every day they chased him without catching him, his legend grew. And legends, once they reach a certain size, no longer need proof. They only need time. Chapter 8, When the Killer Starts to Lie. At first, everyone assumed the letters were truth. Not moral truth. Not emotional truth. But factual truth, the hard, boring kind investigators rely on. Dates. Locations. Methods. Zodiac had trained them well. He fed them just enough accuracy to make every new word feel necessary. Then the cracks appeared. A letter arrived claiming a murder that did not exist. No body. No report. No missing person that fit. Another hinted at details from a crime that had already been solved, as if he were reaching backward, rewriting events that no longer belonged to him. He corrected the record when newspapers miscounted his victims, then exaggerated the number with theatrical flourish. It was not confusion. It was control. Zodiac was no longer documenting reality. He was editing it. Detectives began marking letters with new annotations. Verified. Unverified. Contradicted. The neat categories offered a sense of order that the content itself refused to respect. The killer had started blending fiction into fact so smoothly that separating them felt like surgery performed with gloves on. The public did not notice the shift immediately. They still read everything. Still leaned closer to the page. Still searched for hidden meaning in every phrase. Zodiac knew this. He understood audience behavior better than most editors. If you give people a mystery, they will forgive almost any inconsistency to keep it alive. He exploited that mercy ruthlessly. In one letter, he mocked the police for failing to protect children, hinting at threats that were never carried out. Schools panicked anyway. Buses rerouted. Parents waited at gates with clenched jaws and silent prayers. Fear did not require proof. It only required suggestion. That was the moment some investigators finally understood. Zodiac was no longer reacting to events. He was manufacturing them. A crime did not need to happen for its consequences to unfold. A sentence on paper could empty streets. A symbol could reroute patrols. A rumor could destroy a reputation faster than any weapon. The killer watched the chaos with a detached curiosity. He tested reactions like a scientist without ethics. What happens if I say this? What happens if I take it back? How many people move when I do nothing at all? The answer was always the same. Enough. Behind closed doors, arguments intensified. Some wanted to ignore future letters entirely, starve him of attention. Others argued that silence would only make him escalate. They were both right. And that was the problem. Zodiac had created a system with no correct response. Engage him, and he grew. Ignore him, and he became unpredictable. The letters slowed, then surged. Each pause felt like a held breath. Each return felt like punishment. The city learned to read absence as carefully as presence. One detective circled a sentence in red ink and stared at it for a long time. It contradicted 3 earlier claims. It was sloppy. Almost careless. For the first time, Zodiac sounded bored. That terrified them more than his confidence ever had. Because bored men change the rules. They seek novelty. They push boundaries. They stop caring about consistency. Truth becomes optional. Lies become tools. The game evolves. And when a killer starts lying openly, it means he no longer needs credibility. He already has something better. An audience that will believe him anyway. The fog rolled in thick that night, swallowing the streets whole. Radios murmured with speculation. Doors locked earlier than usual. Somewhere, a man folded a letter he had no intention of sending, just to see how it felt. He smiled, dissatisfied. Because even lies get dull eventually. And Zodiac was beginning to wonder what would happen next if he simply stopped explaining himself at all. That question would linger. Unanswered. Just the way he liked it. Chapter 9, The Silence That Followed. Then, without ceremony, the noise stopped. No warning. No farewell. No final riddle pretending to be a gift. Just silence, wide, uncomfortable, and impossible to interpret. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The mailroom stayed empty. Phones rang for other reasons. The city waited like a listener holding a breath that never quite finished. Silence is not peace. Silence is ambiguity with good posture. Detectives did not celebrate. They did not relax. They checked and rechecked routines, half expecting the quiet to snap back like a trap. Every unrelated crime felt suspicious. Every anonymous letter made hands tremble before opening it. Zodiac had taught them a reflex they could not unlearn. The files grew thicker anyway. Newspaper clippings yellowed at the edges. Tape recordings lost clarity. Ink faded, but not meaning. The evidence rooms became museums of unresolved intention. Cardboard boxes labeled with careful handwriting waited patiently for a future that did not arrive. Some said Zodiac had died. A heart attack in a modest apartment. A car accident on a forgettable road. Others believed he had been arrested for something small, something unrelated, and simply ran out of opportunity. There were theories about moves to other states, other names, other lives. The truth did not volunteer itself. Retirements began. One by one, investigators packed up desks they had hoped to clear with answers. They took home pens, photographs, habits. The case followed them anyway. It showed up in dreams, in half-heard voices on the radio, in the way they still noticed license plates without trying. The city aged, and so did the fear. It softened at the edges, became historical. People spoke about Zodiac the way they spoke about old earthquakes, with fascination, not urgency. College students debated suspects over cheap beer. Hobbyists redrew maps with modern tools, confident that distance had sharpened insight. It had not. New ciphers surfaced. Old ones were reinterpreted. Every few years, someone claimed a breakthrough. Headlines flared briefly, then cooled. The cycle repeated, comforting in its predictability. Zodiac had achieved something rare. He had outlived relevance without losing mystery. Families of victims learned to live with unfinished sentences. There were no trials to attend. No verdicts to reject or accept. Just anniversaries that arrived without asking permission. Time did not heal anything. It simply rearranged priorities. The silence endured. And in that silence, a quiet question grew heavier with each passing year. What if this was the point? Not escape. Not triumph. But erasure without resolution. Zodiac had never promised an ending. That promise was invented by those who needed one. He disappeared the way he had lived inside the case, on his own terms, leaving others to do the work of meaning. A retired detective once said, off the record, that the worst part was not failing to catch the man. The worst part was realizing that catching him would not have fixed what he broke. Silence has a strange gravity. It pulls stories inward until they collapse under their own unanswered weight. The city learned to live with it, but it never learned to like it. Some nights, when fog rolled in just right, people still listened a little harder for phones that did not ring. Not because they wanted him back, but because absence, unresolved, can be louder than any confession. And the story, unfinished, refused to stay buried. It was still breathing, waiting for its last word, which never came. Chapter 10: The Price of Not Knowing. Unsolved cases do not stay in files. They move into people. Years passed, and the world learned new fears. New killers. New headlines. Technology improved. Databases grew smarter. Faces aged out of relevance. But Zodiac remained, stubborn and undefined, like a word no one could translate but everyone recognized. The price of not knowing was never paid all at once. It was paid in installments. Victims' families learned the choreography of grief without closure. They answered the same questions for decades, always politely, always patiently, as if repetition might eventually summon truth. They learned that sympathy has an expiration date, but loss does not. Some stopped hoping. Others refused to. Both choices were exhausting. Former investigators carried the case like a second spine. They compared notes at retirement parties, funerals, chance meetings at grocery stores. Conversations drifted back to the same question, asked without optimism. Did you ever think it was him? The answer changed depending on the year, the mood, the memory being revisited. Suspicion became a habit rather than a conclusion. Doubt settled in like dust, thin, persistent, impossible to clean completely. The suspects, cleared or not, aged in public imagination. Some died under the weight of accusation. Others lived long enough to see themselves become trivia, footnotes in documentaries narrated by voices too young to remember the fear firsthand. The killer, unnamed, stayed perfectly preserved. That was the irony. Everyone else moved on. He stayed exactly where he had been left, between certainty and speculation. Not a man anymore, but a concept. A cipher larger than any code he had written. Amateur investigators took over where institutions had failed. They built websites, forums, flowcharts with confidence unburdened by consequence. They argued passionately, viciously, lovingly. Each theory was treated like a rescue attempt. Someone had to be right eventually. But being right, it turned out, was not the same as proving it. Black humor crept in over the years, as it always does when pain overstays its welcome. Jokes about how Zodiac would never be caught because he enjoyed the chase too much. Irony about a killer remembered more for his letters than his victims. Laughter that sounded wrong but felt necessary. Even horror needs relief. The price of not knowing was also paid by truth itself. Facts blurred into interpretations. Interpretations hardened into beliefs. Beliefs became identities. The case stopped being about evidence and became about allegiance. People chose answers the way they chose teams. And Zodiac, silent, won every argument. Because absence cannot be contradicted. One retired detective sat alone one night, surrounded by boxes he had promised himself he would never open again. He unfolded a photocopy of a letter, edges soft from handling. He did not read the words. He already knew them. What he studied instead was the space between lines. The pauses. The restraint. The confidence of someone who never needed to explain everything. He realized then that the case had taught him something he had never wanted to learn. Justice is not guaranteed. Truth is not owed. And meaning is something people manufacture when reality refuses to cooperate. Zodiac had not escaped because he was brilliant. He had escaped because systems are fragile and time is patient. Outside, the city glowed differently now. Taller buildings. Brighter lights. Less fog, or maybe just better lamps. Somewhere, people laughed, unaware of how close they lived to an unanswered question. That was the final cost. Not fear. Not death. But the quiet understanding that some stories end not with answers, but with endurance. And the ones who endure are rarely the ones who deserve to. One chapter remained. Not to explain. But to sit with what could not be fixed. Chapter 11, Truth is not always the ending. The city never received a final letter. No confession wrapped in regret. No triumphant signature under a solved code. No aging man stepping forward with shaking hands and a rehearsed speech about demons and destiny. History, it turned out, was under no obligation to be neat. People waited anyway. They waited the way you wait for a storm that has already passed, listening for thunder that will not come, convincing yourself that vigilance is the same as control. Zodiac became a story told in fragments, each fragment polished by repetition until it felt smooth enough to hold without bleeding. But it still cut. The truth was never hiding in a cipher. It was hiding in plain sight, in something far less dramatic. Zodiac had exposed a flaw that could not be arrested or interrogated. The world wanted endings. Reality preferred pauses. He had killed, yes. That much was real, documented, irreversible. But the deeper damage lived elsewhere. In the realization that meaning could be hijacked. That attention could be weaponized. That fear, once introduced, did not require upkeep. Zodiac did not vanish because he was caught. He vanished because he no longer needed to speak. The machine he built kept running without him. Speculation replaced evidence. Myth replaced men. Every new generation inherited the question without inheriting the cost. Curiosity became clean, academic, safe. That was the final irony. The killer who demanded recognition was remembered forever, while the people he destroyed became supporting characters in someone else's mystery. Not erased, just softened, simplified, made easier to digest. No moral arrived to correct that imbalance. There was no lesson neat enough to print. Somewhere, an old phone sat unplugged in a box, its silence heavier than any recorded call. Somewhere, a file rested on a shelf labeled unsolved, as if that word explained anything at all. It did not. The case taught no heroism. It offered no closure. It did not even promise understanding. What it left behind was simpler, and harder to accept. Sometimes truth does not arrive late. Sometimes it never arrives at all. And the absence is not a puzzle to be solved, but a weight to be carried, by the living, long after the dead have stopped waiting. The Zodiac wanted to be understood. Instead, he became permanent. And that may be the most honest ending this story was ever going to allow. The end.